So, it's really caught my eye recently. Something developing in Brazil that feels, well, a bit unusual.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
The federal justice there is like demanding a full breakdown of First Lady Janja's international travel expenses.
Oh,
It's just not the sort of thing you see popping up in the headlines every day. Feels a little out of nowhere.
interesting. Yeah, the judiciary getting involved in travel costs like that. It does make you wonder about the background, the context.
Exactly. And there's a deadline. The government and Janja herself have 20 days to lay out all the costs and the reasons behind the trips.
20 days. Yeah.
But here's where it gets, well, particularly interesting when you dig a bit. There's talk, kind of background chatter, that a previous administration faced way tighter deadlines for similar info, like 48 hours.
Wow, 48 hours versus 20 days.
Yeah. That 20-day window, it just feels quite different, doesn't it? Almost like there's maybe a bit more breathing room this time.
That definitely raises the question of what's really behind this. Is it just, standard government oversight, or are there maybe other dynamics at play influencing things?
Right. Okay, so let's really get into the nuts and bolts here. The federal justice in the federal district, they have officially set this 20-day deadline. It's for the government and First Lady Rosângela Silva Janja to explain the spending on her trips abroad.
Okay, but there's a really crucial point here, one that could easily get missed. While they are asking for the explanation, the justice system actually denied the request to immediately cut off the funding for these trips.
Ah, okay. So it's a demand for information, not like a stop order.
Exactly. It's not like they've grounded her, so to speak.
Got it. And the person who actually kicked this whole thing off legally, turns out it was a city councilman from Curitiba, from the Partido Novo.
Partido Novo. Okay, that adds a layer, politically speaking. They're often in opposition to the current government, right?
That's generally their position, yeah. So you could potentially see their motivation through that specific lens.
Sure, makes sense.
And the judge handling the case is Leonardo Tavares Saraiva. Now, his reasons for not freezing the travel funds, they're quite telling. He basically said the councilman hadn't properly shown periculum in mora.
Right, periculum in mora. For you listening, that essentially just means danger and delay.
Yeah.
So the judge didn't see strong enough proof that waiting for this explanation would cause some kind of immediate, irreversible harm.
Right. It's like, where's the fire, basically. And the judge also said the councilman didn't sufficiently demonstrate fumus boni iuris, another one of those Latin phrases.
Fumus boni iuris. Sounds impressive.
It does.
It translates roughly to the plausibility of the legal claim, or sometimes smoke of a good right.
So, put simply,
the judge felt the initial legal argument wasn't strong enough to warrant taking the pretty drastic step of stopping the funding right away.
Okay. And here's another detail that kind of jumped out at me from the reports. The judge actually noted that the councilman hadn't even shown evidence that he tried asking the government for the information directly first.
Oh.
Before going to court. And then he'd been turned down. It's almost like he skipped a step, maybe? Went straight for the legal action.
Yeah. That could suggest the court viewed it as maybe a procedural shortcut, which wouldn't have helped his case for immediate, urgent action.
So the practical upshot of this 20-day deadline without any funds being cut off is that Janja can, continue her international travel as planned, for now at least.
Right. Business as usual on the travel front, pending the explanation.
And the reports we've been looking at, they highlight some interesting points about her travel patterns and the potential costs involved.
Yeah, what seems to stand out is this difference between when she travels officially with the presidential delegation and when she seems to travel more independently.
Exactly. We're seeing these examples mentioned, like trips to Russia and China, where Janja apparently arrived up to a week before the president did.
A whole week before.
Yeah. Which, immediately makes you think about separate flights, maybe separate hotel bookings, potentially a much higher overall cost compared to just being part of the main group.
Sure, that naturally leads to questions about, the necessity and the justification for those kinds of separate arrangements and the extra expense involved.
And one of the commentaries we came across even framed this whole legal challenge as potentially being filling sausage, just noise.
Filling sausage, like a distraction.
Yeah, like a distraction, something to grab headlines, maybe keep people talking about this instead of other things, but without necessarily having a huge real-world effect. We're just reporting that interpretation, of course, not saying it's right or wrong.
Understood. It's certainly a perspective reflecting maybe a degree of cynicism. about the whole thing, the motives behind it, and what it'll actually achieve.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly here because something else related came up in the material we reviewed. It started with a pretty big question, actually.
Okay.
If the sort of traditional view is that socialism has, broadly failed economically, how do we square that with the massive economic success story we've seen in China?
Yeah. That's a huge question, one that really gets to the core of how we even label and understand different economic and political systems today.
Well, the argument presented in our sources is that China's incredible growth spurt wasn't really driven by old school socialist principles at all,
Right.
but rather by opening up to the market, embracing capitalist ideas, essentially. You think about Deng Xiaoping's reforms back in the day.
Especially economic zones.
Exactly.
Right.
Allowing private property, becoming the quote-unquote world's factory. That's the argument for what really fueled their economic engine.
It's the core idea presented. It was market mechanisms, not strict socialist doctrine, that unlocked that growth.
But then you absolutely have to look at the other side of the China coin, right? The nature of the society, how it's run.
Definitely.
We're talking about a system with incredibly tight state control over many aspects of life. Huge limits on personal freedoms. I mean, no Google for most people. No YouTube, no Instagram.
The Great Firewall.
Right. Widespread censorship, state surveillance being pretty much constant. And then there's the argument that, okay, the official slogan might be something like socialism for the masses, but in reality, it's often the elite who are reaping the biggest rewards from what looks a lot like a very state-managed form of capitalism.
It really highlights that central paradox of China, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You have this significant economic opening existing right alongside very tight ongoing political control and restrictions.
And we probably shouldn't forget the point raised about how some of that rapid development happened. The argument that, well, a fair bit of it involved acquiring Western innovation.
You mean through things like alleged piracy, patent issues?
Yeah, patent theft, industrial espionage. The sources suggest that this played a pretty significant role, too, in helping them catch up and grow so quickly.
Which, of course, brings up big questions about the ethics of that path to growth and the impact on international relations.
And this all kind of loops back to a potential disconnect or maybe hypocrisy that the sources touched on.
How so?
Well, they give the example of, say, online influencers who might publicly champion socialist ideals while very happily using and profiting from capitalist platforms and products. You know, the classic socialism for you but not for me idea.
Right. I see the parallel.
And they even mentioned seeing echoes of this in Brazil, though no specific names were given, where you might have wealthy individuals who publicly praise local systems like education or healthcare.
But then send their own kids to universities abroad or use international hospitals themselves.
Exactly that. It just sort of underscores the complexities and sometimes the contradictions in how people actually live versus maybe what they publicly advocate for.
It's rarely simple, black and white, when you look closely at how these different systems operate in practice and how people navigate them.
So the kind of wrap-up point on China seemed to be this. Maybe it's not accurate to call it a model of innovative socialism. A more fitting description, according to one source, might be a very state-controlled capitalism where the authoritarian government keeps an iron grip. Someone called it authoritarianism with Wi-Fi.
Authoritarianism with Wi-Fi. Yeah, that's quite pithy. It captures that blend, doesn't it? A system that's delivered undeniable economic results for sure, but arguably at a steep cost in terms of individual liberty and using methods that have definitely attracted criticism globally.
Okay, so let's pull these threads together then. We started with this situation in Brazil. Federal justice wants answers on the First Lady's travel spending. 20-day deadline.
Right. But crucially, no immediate stop to the funding.
Exactly. And the judge's reasoning focused on basically not enough proof of immediate harm or a strong enough initial legal case for that drastic step.
And we also touched on Janja's travel itself. The instances of traveling separately, potentially arriving much earlier than the president, raising cost questions.
And then we broadened out, connecting it to this whole complex discussion about China, questioning those easy labels of socialism versus capitalism.
And looking at how China's economic model seems to blend market principles with very strong state control and political restrictions.
So here's maybe something for you to chew on after this. This legal action about Janja's travel in Brazil, do you see it as a genuine move towards more accountability? Or is it perhaps more symbolic, maybe politically motivated, without much practical bite?
That's a great question.
And then what does that whole comparison with China's economic system tell us about how these big labels, socialism, capitalism, often get really blurry and complicated in the real world? It makes you think about the motivations behind the different narratives we hear, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Asking why certain arguments are being made is just as important as understanding the arguments themselves.
Yeah. So if any of this sparked your interest, you might want to dig a bit deeper into, say, the actual laws around government spending in Brazil, or the detailed economic history of China since Deng Xiaoping, or even just the general topic of how public figures' travel and expenses are scrutinized around the world.
There's always more layers to peel back if you're curious.
And that really is what we try to do here, give you a shortcut through these complex topics, lay out the different angles so you can make sense of it all without getting bogged down.
Hopefully giving you the key points to think about.
Exactly. So until our next deep dive,